This is Treks to Nowhere. All right, so as long as I can remember, I have had a deep fascination and almost unyielding pull to the faraway, to the tiny little recesses and corners of the world, places that would be seemingly insignificant to just about anyone else in the world, but for whatever reason, be it geographical, political, topographical, they carry with them an immense sense of wonder and awe, almost a mystique, and I just can't help myself to want to try and go and explore these places. I'm like a moth to a flame. Now, I don't know what it is that's at the root of this feeling. I just know it's something I've carried with me forever. And it's probably part of the reason why I've spent 9 field seasons in Antarctica and spent months of my life through hiking on remote trails and stood on the tiniest of islands off the coast of New Zealand. There's just something about these remote and obscure places, these geographical oddities, that draws me in. It's also why if you were to come to my house and look through my bookshelf, you'd see collections like Atlas Obscura and the Atlas of Remote Islands, because I just can't get enough of these very weird oddities and remote places. Now, I've also talked a lot in my videos about how I believe in many ways I was meant to be an explorer, and so seeking out these very remote places, for whatever reason, really tickles that sort of explorational pioneer feeling within me. And I feel like I'm finding a place, setting foot on a place that no human has ever visited under the same circumstances or for the same reasons. Now, sometime about 15 years ago, I noticed that this feeling, this desire to go out and seek out obscure geographical oddities in remote places really started to well up inside me with a fierceness that I'd never really experienced before. And so it resulted in me actually starting to go out and not just think about these places or pointing them out on a map, but actually going to explore them. And I gotta tell you, it's been probably the best 15 years of my life just geeking out on these ridiculously weird places that, again, would be seemingly insignificant to just about anyone else in the world. Now, as I started visiting these remote and obscure geographical oddities, I also started documenting it. I started putting down all of my notes, my photos, my trip reports, the details, the motivation, why I was seeking out that specific spot in a very detailed journal online. And over the years, that journal has grown and gotten remarkably big. So what I realized about 2 years ago as I was going through this collection, reminiscing, is that not only am I really proud of the places that I visited and geek out when I go back and reread them, but that I want to share my experiences with all of you. So that brings us to today and the purpose of this new video series that I'm titling Treks to Nowhere. Starting today, I'm going to be sharing with you all some of my favorite stories of exploration out to these remote and strange geographical oddities. Now, in the background, for the past year and a half or so, I've actually been hard at work compiling all of those trip reports, documents, photos into a much more formal collection, a text that I'm going to put out and publish and make available to anyone that wants it, that wants to really dig into the specific details of each of my trips. Okay, so for this first episode, I'm going to take you all back to 2016 and tell you a story about how I visited one of the most remote territories of Canada, but in a very unique way. The Canadian territory of Nunavut is actually Canada's newest territory and was only officially established in 1999. Now, if you read my full trip report for this expedition, which I will put a link for down below, you'll see that I did a ton of research on all of the land rights, the territorial creation, the different peoples that live in Nunavut, which primarily are Inuit, and just all of the nuances and intricacies of how that territory was established. And what you'll find is that it's actually incredibly complicated how the borders were drawn, because you have different peoples claiming sovereignty to different parts of the land that is made up of the legislative territory of Nunavut. Now, if you just pull out a map of Canada and you look at the borders of Nunavut, you might just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, okay, whatever, that's the new territory. But what you don't realize is behind those borders, there was months and months and years of debate about which group of peoples get to claim sovereignty over which parts of the land, because Nunavut, while a Canadian legislative territory, is home to Inuit peoples and Cree peoples, which also claim their own sovereignty to parts of the land, similar to the United States, where you might have Navajo living on the Navajo Nation, which is a sovereign nation, but also within the state of Arizona and in the country of the United States. So rather than take you down a rather complicated series of rabbit holes explaining the whole history of the creation and establishment of Nunavut, I'm instead going to explain to you the motivation behind why I wanted to try and visit Nunavut and visit it in the way that I did. Now, one of the things that makes Nunavut such an interesting place is that it's really hard to get to. There are no roads in and out of the territory of Nunavut. So if you want to get there, you've either got to fly, take a boat, or hike really, really far on foot in the northernmost remote woods of Canada. Now, I'm sure somebody out there has done that, but for the sake of my purposes, I wanted to try something a little bit different. And this is where it becomes a little bit more of a trek to nowhere, to an obscure and remote place. Because sure, all of Nunavut is in some sense remote, but where I decided to go explore is about as remote as it gets. Now, I spent a lot of time just playing around in Google Maps, exploring strange places around the world, and I noticed something really unique about Nunavut. If you trace the border of the territory, it actually swoops down into Hudson Bay and all the way down into James Bay. And when I looked into it further, what I realized is that the Land Agreement Act that was used to establish the territory of Nunavut, there's a specific portion of that agreement that says all of the islands within the James Bay and the Hudson Bay will be part of the territory of Nunavut. Now, obviously, it gets complicated depending on which native or indigenous peoples live on those islands, whether or not they're established as, say, part of the Cree Nation or part of Inuit territory. The territory of Canada, of Nunavut, includes all islands within James Bay. Here's where it gets interesting though. If you zoom in to James Bay, there are a lot of islands that are just a mile offshore that technically are all part of Nunavut, even if they swoop way down south near the province of Quebec. So I think you see where I'm going with this. I spent a lot of time studying all of the specific islands of James Bay, the Hudson Bay. I started doing research about, is it actually true that every single island, even if it's just a pebble sticking up out of the ground, is technically part of Nunavut? And everything that I was able to establish is that yes, if an island exists within the James Bay, no matter how far south it is part of the territory of Nunavut. So I wanted to visit the territory of Nunavut without flying. Now, I couldn't do it on foot because I just not going to trek for thousands of miles across northern Canada, but I could do it by boat. So this leads to the trek to nowhere, and the idea I had was to try and drive up as close as I could get to the edge of James Bay in a car, get myself out to the coast, inflate a pack raft, and paddle out to one of these small islands within the James Bay, and therefore set foot within the territory of Nunavut. So that was my plan on how I was going to make it to Nunavut without flying and without having to trek hundreds of thousands of miles on foot. So here's where the story begins. In September of 2016, I was living in central Vermont, kind of near the Canadian border actually. On a random day, I did some searching and found that there's a company that rents pack rafts. So I called them up. They sent me a pack raft to my house a few days later, and I had it for an entire week. I think it cost me $70. Threw it in the back of my car, and on a random Friday, I called off work. So it's gonna be something like 1,800 miles of driving. And
Yeah, so here we go. I'm going to head up to Burlington and then cross the border by Montreal. And then basically it's just hours and hours and hours of remote country roads in Quebec. So it'll get pretty old, but I'm excited.
Got in my car, drove the hour up to Burlington, parked my car in a long-term parking garage at the airport, and rented a brand new car with better gas mileage from a national car rental company. I threw all my stuff from my car in the rental car, and I started driving. And I started driving a lot. First, I headed across the border, and I, of course, had to go through border control and declare my intentions. And when asked what I was doing in Canada, I just said recreating, boating, exploring. I didn't say anything weird, like trying to set foot into Nunavut without flying. And I headed north through Montreal, got stuck in some really nasty rush hour traffic. Now by mid-afternoon, I was several hundred miles north of Montreal, way up into the boonies of Quebec. The gas stations were very few and far between. No one spoke English anymore. I had to really pull out some old French from years ago when I lived in Montreal, and it was, it was clumsy, but I made my way through it. But eventually, I made my way through this town of Val d'Or, and it was somewhere around that point that I started to kind of make a northern trajectory up towards James Bay. And it was really at that point where kind of all services cut out and where I was kind of in it for the long haul. Now, before you actually reach the James Bay Road itself, which is the remote road that goes 600 kilometers north up to the James Bay, you go through one final town, and this town is called Matagami. And I stopped in this town just at nightfall, fumbled my way through some French, and I caught a few words of the gas station attendant telling me to make sure to register if I'm going on the James Bay Road, and to watch out for moose because there have been 2 moose crashes that night already. So I was a little bit concerned. I was also really concerned about fuel availability. The James Bay Road is 600 kilometers, almost 400 miles without fuel. I had a car that was telling me it got 400 miles on a tank. And so I had a 3-gallon spare fuel canister in the car that I brought with me for that exact purpose. But you never know, you never know if you're actually gonna get 400 miles or not. So I was kind of nail biting the whole time on this road. Now, when I got out of Matagami, I passed through a gate, which was the entrance to the road where I was supposed to register, but no one was there. So I never registered, I just kept going. And I started driving. At about 9 p.m. I started driving, maybe even a little bit later. And for the next 600 kilometers, I drove the most remote road I have ever been on in my life. I didn't see a single car, a single person, a single animal, a single headlight, a single light of any kind other than starlight. It was truly desolate, remote, surreal, otherworldly, whatever descriptor you want to use. I felt like I was riding across a different planet, and it was wild. One of the most satisfying drives I've ever had in my life, the James Bay Road. Now, at some point on this drive, I did have to stop to catch a few Z's, slept for a couple hours in the back of the car, filled up my spare fuel canister, and then headed on. Now, as the sun started to come up, I felt a lot better, and I saw that my mileage was getting very close. Now, the little indicator on my car that said miles to empty was telling me I had about 60 miles to empty, and the map was telling me I had about 35 to the final town that I was headed to, a town called Chisasibi, which is a Cree town where they actually speak English as well. So it was very strange to drive for 600 kilometers through open, desolate wasteland, all technically part of Quebec, to end up in a tiny Cree Nation village where everyone speaks perfect English. It was very strange. But sure enough, I rolled into Chisasibi sometime in the early morning, right as my fuel light came on, pulled into a gas station and topped it off. So it was absolutely perfect fuel management on my part. And I made sure to kind of drive a little bit slower through the night so that I wasn't burning excess fuel. Now, when I got to town, I had some breakfast and immediately headed right to the shores of James Bay. Here's what's cool about Chisasibi is that you can actually drive out on dirt roads from town right to the shores of the James Bay. Right there, right on the beach. And while you're standing on that beach, you can look out and see those islands that are just a mile or two out and part of Nunavut. So, as you would probably imagine, I headed straight for the beach, unloaded my car, inflated the pack raft right there on the beach, hopped in the boat, and paddled my way 2 miles out into the bay, the very cold bay, because it was September after all. And technically the James Bay is part of the Arctic Ocean. And about 30 to 40 minutes later, I pulled up onto a beach of a very small island, less than an acre in size. And you'll never guess what the name of that island is. Officially on maps, it's titled Tiny Island. So there I was, 2 miles from shore, standing on a 1 acre piece of land that incidentally is made up of 1 to 2 billion year old metamorphosed granite, a type of rock called a gneiss. So true Canadian shield, ancient rock, in the middle of the James Bay, in the middle of September, on a cold, windy, rainy day, all by myself without a soul around, standing in the territory of Nunavut. Now, obviously, based on the title of this video series, I've explored quite a few places, but I gotta tell you, the reason I'm starting with this particular trek is because it really was probably one of the most satisfying that I've ever been on, hands down. Just being on this tiny little parcel of land, I felt like I was in full ownership of it. It was my little piece of land in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of Nunavut, in the middle of the James Bay, in the middle of Canada. And here's the best part about it was, as I walked around this little island, I found a polar bear carcass. So at some point, that island, tiny island, had been visited by a resident polar bear. And I sat down, brewed myself a little coffee, had a snack on the island, spent about 2 hours just resting, absorbing just the nature of the situation. Now, as I left the island, I picked up a small rock on the shore of the beach and brought it home and put it in my rock tumbler. And now I've got this beautifully polished piece of gneiss from the Canadian Shield that I keep as a souvenir from my visit to Nunavut. Now, when I left the island, I got in my little pack raft and I actually paddled to a second island, which actually doesn't have a name on the map. But I explored that island quite a bit, found all sorts of evidence of glacial scouring, glacial grooves, and it started getting me thinking about something that I ended up coming home later and investigating. Now, I study ice sheets, I study ice movement and deformation, and as I was looking at all this evidence of glacial activity on this little island, I realized the ice sheet from the last ice age has only recently retreated from this part of Canada, in the last few thousand years. And so all of that part of Canada is actually slowly rising. It's a phenomenon we call isostatic rebound or isostatic adjustment. So I started thinking, if the ground is lifting a few millimeters a year or whatever it is, at some point, Tiny Island is going to not be an island anymore. It's going to be connected to the mainland. So, does that mean I'm going to have to go back in 50 years and paddle out to another island? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Now, if you're interested more in this story, I will provide you 2 really important links. First is the link to the video that I created when I actually made this visit, so you can see footage from my actual time on the island. And second, I'll send you the link to my trip report over on my web journal. Now, as I said, I'm putting a collection together of a full text, and this will be one of the featured treks within that book. So keep in mind there's a lot more detail that I'm leaving out of this short summary, but I wanted to keep the video reasonable in length. So I really am excited about sharing all these adventures with you, sharing all these stories. I'm gonna try and put out one new story every couple of weeks in this series. And hopefully by the time I get through 10 or 15 of them, the book will be ready to be in print and published. So I'm just doing all the final editing on it now. There's a lot of editing. I'm realizing trying to convert old web journal posts that are very sloppily written takes a lot of refinement to actually get it into proper form. I feel like I'm editing a manuscript for a scientific journal sometimes. But I do plan on putting out sort of semi-regular videos in this new series of Treks to Nowhere. So the other thing you might be wondering right now is, where the heck am I? Where am I hiking? Well, it turns out I've actually been hiking to one of my favorite places in Flagstaff, and also one of the most remote places, and that's Woody Mountain. I love coming out to this place because the trails are beautiful, they're pristine, they're well maintained, and there's never anybody here. I'm always the only car in the parking lot, and I have no idea why, because it's such an amazing place. And so this is sort of my little secret gem. I always love coming out here when I just need to get away, clear my head, or I just need a little bit of solitude. So there you have it. We'll end this video with a nice view from the summit of Woody Mountain. There's the tower. All right, well, I really hope you enjoyed my story about my trek to nowhere up to Nunavut, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take care, be safe.